Hey, Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about consonants versus dissonance. It's like the conversation of light versus dark. There's all this stuff in between light and dark. There's this process of going between them, and it's a very deep discussion, but it's pretty easy to understand at a basic level. It's like pop culture. Like you could look at it and say, "Oh, that's the bad guy, that's the good guy. That's the consonant guy, that's the dissonant guy." But then you can get into literature and it's like, oh, is that bad guy really bad? Like he has all this backstory that kind of drive his actions. He's kind of justified a little bit, but he's like doing wrong stuff. But is it really wrong from what he's doing? You know, you get into all these weird things. You begin to question things. Consonants for dissonance is a lot like that. So consonant intervals or consonant sounds are sounds that are generally okay. You are agreeable. They're pleasurable to listen to. And we're going to get into the different kinds of consonances academically, but it gets weird. So for example, these are some consonant sounds. So we have like an octave, very constant. It's like, oh, that's nice. We have a perfect fifth. It's like, oh, that's very nice. There's actually ratios and a whole bunch of math. We don't care so much about that right now. These can be pretty deep discussions. And then we have things like dissonances, stuff that sounds like this. It's like, it sounds unsettling. You want to resolve it. Now you might be going, that's pretty much always going to sound dissonant. You might think that. But when you begin to listen to music, you get really used to consonant sounds and they slowly become boring. And you get into dissonant sounds, and the more you listen to them, the more they become consonant. If you were to listen to this over and over and over, it becomes less and less appalling and more agreeable. You begin to get used to it. And so we get into these weird things where things that are normally dissonant in one setting would not be dissonant in another. For example, we could play a chord like this, which is honestly not that dissonant, but it is considered dissonant. You want it to resolve to that, right? That's what you would like it to become. And if you were to throw something like this into jazz, just as a general, I know this is pretty large generalization, but if you were to throw it into a jazz context, it would be pretty okay just as this. You would go along your way and you'd leave it like that. You would feel no obligation to change it. It would be considered consonant. But if you were to throw it into like a Bach piece, that would sound pretty dissonant. You'd want to fix that. That's something that would want to be fixed. And Bach has some really cool examples. All of them do. So of examples where dissonance is used to make consonant things sound better, when it's the whole opposition thing. When you experience some great act of evil, the smallest act of good after that will be much larger than it would have been before. When your whole, like, let's say your home burnt down and some people brought some dinner over for you, that dinner means a lot more to you after your home burnt down than it would have before. I mean, we could make all sorts of cases and it probably involve making all sorts of inferences, but the point is saying it's been magnified. You take more notice of it than you typically would have because of what came before. And so by using consonants and dissonance in our music, we establish interesting music. There's a whole bunch of other things because you can have rhythmic consonances and rhythmic dissonances, but there are some academic ways of breaking this down. So consonant intervals, there are perfect consonances, and then there are non-perfect, meaning major or minor. So anything with a P next to it is something that was just deemed consonant pretty much all the time. It sounds really nice. And so we have like the unison, the perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and perfect eighth. And if we were to play them, here's the unison. We go, oh, it's just a note. So obviously that's got to be consonant. If we play like an octave or a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth. And there's actually math backing all this up. We can get into all sorts of weird 20th century stuff some other time. Now, you have things that are not as consonant, but they still are, and that would be major and minor intervals. Now, the second is sort of an exception, but if you think of like the third and the sixth, those are considered consonant. So things like this. They don't sound as consonant as per se an octave. They're not as unified, but they are still pleasing, and you can end there, and it sounds pretty all right. And you can combine various versions of consonances and dissonances. So here's a perfect fifth and a major third, all consonant intervals. And you could also combine dissonant intervals. And so dissonance ones this can get quite deep, but we're just gonna stick with, we have our sevens, so major and minor 7, major and minor second, and we also have this tritone here, and that's pretty. For a long time, this was like whoa, that's like a crazy interval. That's a tritone, right? And then we also have the seconds and the sevenths, and we could get, whoops, that was a 6. Sorry, here's some. So that's like ooh, and if you put them close together, we have this idea of distance. So if one note's far away from another, our dissonance is reduced. And there's various reasons for this, and we can actually get into sound design and undo that, make it actually worse if we wanted to. But typically when we're dealing with instruments, this tends to be the trend. It just happens naturally. You can synthetically change this. So we have the idea that, so we have consonants that are like really consonant, and then some less powerful consonants, and then we have dissonances, and we notice that we have what a lot of people would call sharp dissonances, and then we have these dull dissonances. We also have, there are a couple, when we talk about dissonances, we generally talk about want to resolve. They want to do something like there's some dissonance introduced and it wants to go somewhere. So you have those, but you also have dissonances that in some contexts are rather neutral. They don't want to go anywhere. They just sit still. They're cool being dissonant, and they don't really pull towards anything. A tritone in jazz is generally treated this way, and under particular circumstances. So we're not going to get too deep into all this stuff. This is stuff that you need to be aware of now as you get going. And we're going to take some notice of some consonance and dissonance, because you can see the contrast. For example, this little thing is a lot more interesting than this. There's more color, so we can get into like color notes and a bunch of stuff, but we have to get into chord building and stuff. But I really felt like we had to cover some of this because it is built in to your scale. When you make melodies, when you make chords, when you think of any music, there's going to be some combination of consonance and dissonance. And a lot of people, when they start out, stick to consonants like frickin' nobody's business. They live by consonants because that's what sounds good. You kind of have to know a thing or two if you're going to start tossing dissonance and color tones in order to get things that are that sound good and they don't violate the rules of what it is you're trying to do. So every genre, like I was talking about earlier, will have their own rules. Maybe certain dissonances are really considered consonant in that genre. And so you need to get familiar with like how these different things work. You know, what are the tendencies? Can you, by just listening to the genre, figure out, oh, they're doing these things with theory? And that's what makes this genre what it is. They might not, the people who originally made it might not even be aware they're doing this, but they'll follow a set pattern. And that's what gives a genre its vibe as far as harmonics are concerned. So these intervals, so if we look at our major scale, for example, we know it's all major intervals, but we notice the major second, and we also have this major, so the major second's a dissonance, and then it's pretty much all consonant with more or less, like it goes from dissonant to consonant, not as consonant, then a perfect consonant and another perfect. So we increase in consonants over the major scale, and then we decrease again until we reach the last two notes. And the last two notes are a half step, and this half step's a pretty special half step because it's a dull half step. If you were to put this note down here next to the C, so it was like, as opposed to up there, really far away from the bottom C, or if we consider it right here, this is pretty close. If you play the C and the B at the same time, I should really have the piano view on so you can see what notes I'm hitting. So you see the C and the B. So if we have this, this is very special. It's a very powerful resolution we can use to our advantage in music. And we can use things, this is why the 5 chord, when we get into building chords, has a special relationship to the 1 chord. When you add the 7, this relationship is enhanced. And so I have like a little thing right here, just showing you, here's a G major 7. And so it's got everything going on for it, and then it resolves to the C major. So it's a pretty small example, but we'll get into a lot more examples like this and talk about all these special conditions where this stuff applies. But it's all consonants and dissonance. So when we're making melodies and songs and stuff, we don't always want to stay consonant. We want to add things like colors. Like we could play something that's pretty simple, like C major. But that's kind of boring. Maybe we want to do something a little spicier, like that's more interesting, at least for me to listen to. You get tired of the same old things as you get more advanced in music because you've played it more. And so that's consonants and dissonance. Hopefully I've cleared up a couple of things. The big thing is you need to know that they're consonants. We have these perfect, major, minor. Second and sevenths are considered these are considered dissonant intervals generally in tonal harmony. That's the way we're going to treat them. They can be considered not dissonant depending on what we're working with. But for our purpose in a class where we're learning how to write tonal harmony music, Western harmony, we're going to treat those as dissonant intervals. But I just need to cover my butt and tell you that hey, these rules can change quite drastically. And the tritone's an interesting character. It holds a bunch of special properties. We won't be worrying about the tritone for a good while. Another thing that you need to be aware of is there are academic ways of considering dissonance as well. So for example, we talked about how we have these weird intervals like the diminished second, which is the same thing as a unison, but a diminished second is academically considered dissonant because it's just a weird deal. I know it sounds like a unison, so you think, wouldn't that be consonant? And the answer is you would consider it dissonant. And that's why it's important to know about keys and stuff, because when you're beginning to analyze music, you'd be like, this is a weird thing. Why would the composer do it this way? The composer must mean for it to be considered as a dissonance. It's sort of like a statement, like the composer's saying, hey, this is what I think about this thing here. And it also comes into play when we're building chords and stuff. Just weird things can come up. And so you need to know that whenever you have something that would typically be like for example, if you had a diminished third, that'd be the same as a major second. And so you'd be like, that's dissonant, but now it's considered more dissonant than it would be if it was considered a major second, because it's like, why would they choose to do that? And so, yeah, we don't go around tossing these intervals around lightly, okay? We take our crap seriously. If you're going to choose to use weird stuff, we're going to ask questions like, why didn't you do this instead? Or did the key force you to do that? And why would you choose to do that instead of doing some other thing? So anyways, that's that. Hopefully this made some sense. The big takeaway is understanding that there's this special relationship going on that will become fundamental, and you'll get the hang of it more and more. We're going to do some exercises to help you see consonants and dissonance, hopefully improve some of your music writing right away in the next video. If you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed day.